Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Czechast, the podcast where we explore all things Czech, history, language and most importantly stories. I'm Vít Pohanka, your host, and today we are delving into the fascinating world of language with someone who has made it both a profession and a passion. Linguist, broadcaster and my colleague at Radio Prague International, Danny Bate. In our conversation we discussed how the Czech language, far from being some pure untouched relic, has always been a blend of influences. For example, the Czech revivalists of the 19th century who sought to purify the language didn't quite unearth some pristine version of Czech.
They were not recognizing, or maybe they thought they were, but they were not actually recognizing some pure diamond-like Czech that had to be cleaned and scraped away from all external influence. That language had never existed. I just mentioned earlier, for example, or the Latin words that already existed in the language, or the words of different origins. There are Celtic words, there are Germanic words in Czech, for example. Pure Czech has never existed.
We also uncovered some surprising connections, like how the common Czech name Pepík, a diminutive of Josef, owes its origins to Italian builders and artisans who came to Bohemia in the 17th and 18th centuries to help construct its grand Baroque architecture.
Giuseppe is the form of Josef, Giuseppe Pepe, and that's how it got into Czech. Yeah, so Pepík is it's actually Italian.
There you go. I mean, already you're getting into just great etymology. All these connections. No language exists in a vacuum. No language is an island, to paraphrase John Donne. All of these things are interconnected, and I just love that.
And even though Danny doesn't speak Czech with his Czech fiancée, the Czech language still holds an important place in their household, especially when it comes to their furry companion.
But we always speak Czech to the cat, who is not Czech, and also a cat, which is absurd. But frankly, I just find that he's not from the Czech Republic, our cat, but he's worthy of the Czech language, and I'm very keen. I stress I vikat with him. I address him in the formal language, of course. He's a very dignified cat, I find.
In today's episode, we'll explore more about Danny's journey as a linguist, his insights into the evolution of language in the 21st century, and for example, how social networks are reshaping the way we speak and write. So, whether you're on a walk or a jog or relaxing at home, get comfortable and let's dive in.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
So my name is Danny Bate. I come originally from the southeast of England. That's the county of Norfolk, for people who know the UK a little bit. And I've lived in the Czech Republic for 5 years now. And what to say about myself? I am a member of the team at Radio Prague International, but a very new member of the team. I've only been here approaching 5 months now. That followed a very sharp kind of career, a new tangent in my career. I was, for the entirety of my adult life so far, a student. I studied a bachelor's degree in the UK, then a master's degree in the UK, and then a PhD in the UK, all of which were in one single subject. So I'm nothing if not consistent. That subject was linguistics, which, as the name may signal, is the study of language, the scientific study of this thing that I'm doing right now. That was a great privilege, an immense pleasure. It defined who I was, as I said, from age 18 onwards. But now I work in Radio Prague. I am very happy to be here. I'm still getting used to it, you could say as well.
We will definitely get into linguistics and what they tell us about Czech language and Czech culture in more depth in a few minutes. But first, let me also ask you, when did you become interested in linguistics and why?
I'm Not entirely sure. It's been such a part of me for such a long time that the origins are not entirely clear. It definitely began at school. I know for a fact it began at school. And I think if I were to trace the chain of causation, it would go back to one particularly good French teacher who recognised that this 14-year-old boy who sat at the front of his class, because it was alphabetical, I'm B for Bate, really got on with certain aspects of the French language. Not the cool parts, not the films and books and everything, but the grammar. And he recognised this in me, and he encouraged me to follow this passion. In the UK, we tend not to do very many subjects for our A-levels, which is your final qualifications, or your higher if you're in Scotland. You tend to just do 4 or 3. And my 3 A-levels at the very end of my school education were French, German and philosophy. I loved all 3 very intensely, and I had this sense that there would be a subject at the intersection of these 3 school subjects. There would be something that would allow me to continue all 3. I wouldn't have to continue to do the French literature that didn't interest me so much. I just liked the grammar, because I'm a nerd, basically. I slowly realised that there is actually a subject at the intersection of all these school subjects, which is linguistics. And I came to this realisation on my own. Linguistics as an academic field is quite young. I think in its modern incarnation has only really been around since, say, the 1930s, 1940s, and consequently public knowledge of the field is not great. People tend to not know what linguistics is or what it involves. It doesn't, for example, involve speaking lots of languages. That's the question that, in fact, we were taught how to handle in my very first lecture of my undergraduate degree, how to explain linguistics to your grandmother. It doesn't, as one person asked me, involve linguini, the Italian pasta, nor does it involve speaking lots of languages. And we were even taught the sort of the sarky response of, oh, you're a rocket scientist, how many rockets can you fly? Like, it's not how it works. It's studying its language in the abstract. So that's me, and I arrived at the University of York in Northern England for my first day of linguistics, not really sure what I'd signed up for. After 2 lectures, I thought, yeah, this is for me.
So where does the Czechness come in? Where does the Czech element of it come in?
Not necessarily where. I would specify from who. There's a person at the heart of this, as there often seems to be. So my fiancée, hopefully soon to be wife, is Czech. We met at the University of York in the first term, in the first week. We shared a flat together, so I have known her for the entirety of my adult life. And she was studying in the UK, I was studying in the UK. After 4 years of degrees, she quite understandably had had enough of the English, the bread, I think, the beer, the prices, and longed for the homeland. I had no plans, so I went with her. To begin with, I was a teacher, as so many people are when they first arrive in this country, an English teacher. I don't think I was particularly good at that job, but I very quickly fell in love with this country and Czech people, Czech culture, and 5 years later, I'm still here.
So let me just make sure that I understand correctly. So before meeting your fiancé, there was nothing to connect you to Czechia or the Czech culture or anything.
Nothing. It is all because of her, which is a daunting thing for me and her to reflect on. I think that I distinctly remember meeting her for the first time in our student flat when I was moving my stuff in on the second day, and she told me that she was from the Czech Republic, and I thought, well, I kind of want to get on with this cute girl, and I want to say something that sounds impressive, but I didn't know anything about the country. I knew it existed, and I knew that Prague was a place, and that was it. And everything has followed since there, so it's all down to one person.
So, could you tell me, do you remember the first time you actually came to Prague? What was it like?
I remember it very, very well. It was a year after we'd been together, and I loved it. I remember many, many moments of being in the city and being outside the city, actually. Carolina was very keen to... That's her name, by the way. She was very keen to show me the rest of the country. She's not from Prague herself. And I remember...
Sorry, where is she from?
She's from the Pardubice region, so the eastern Bohemia, a region that I've got to know very well, which surprises a lot of Czechs as to why I know this region quite so intimately. It's not a primary destination. You won't find it on on Booking.com or not Booking.com. You won't find it on TripAdvisor or something like that. I remember many great first impressions of the country on that very first trip. The very first pub that we went into, I thought the beer tasted pretty good. And one memory that absolutely sticks out for me was being in Český Krumlov, which is gorgeous and lovely, and we have gone back several times since. But specifically, the behaviour of the Czechs on the river there. All of these Czechs going down the weirs, the breakwaters in Český Krumlov, shouting ahoy and drinking beer. And I thought, I quite like this country.
So it was positive, yeah? It wasn't negative.
Very positive, yeah.
Český Krumlov, quite frankly, can be quite crowded or overcrowded, I would say.
Yes, absolutely.
A funny thing that you mentioned that Karolina is from the Pardubice region, it just brought to my mind. I've got this other friend who actually works in the media, Ray Furlong. He was the BBC correspondent here in Prague a few years back. He works for Radio Free Europe station, and the reason why I mentioned that, to this day, he says that he was very lucky. He came in the early 1990s to then, I think it was still Czechoslovakia, and he ended up in Pardubice. And he said it was because there was no place for him in Prague, and at first he was quite unhappy that he has to go to this smaller town. But he says now that nothing better could have happened to him, because he really got to know Czechia, the country, Pardubice, a smaller town, even though in the Czech context it's a larger city. So for him it was, he stayed I think 1 or 2 years there teaching, and he says it was the real school of Czechoslovak then, or Czech life, So I think there is something to be said about such things.
I could not agree more.
Danny, by the way, I checked your website, dannybate.com. I highly recommend to all the listeners to go and check it, because there are a lot of interesting articles, and one that I really find very, very interesting, that caught my eye, was verba bohemica, the oldest Latin words in Czech. Now, I have to admit that even though long time ago, but I studied Czech language and literature, I had no idea that, for example, the Czech word osel, for donkey, is actually of Latin origin, and there were quite a few other words that you mention in the article. So can you just tell us a little bit about this article and how the idea occurred to you?
Well, it is enormously flattering for you to endorse my website in that regard. It's always a little strange for me to be confronted with the fact that people actually read these things. Yes, that particular piece was, it came very naturally to me that every month I try to post something, write up something. That's for my own benefit. I think primarily it keeps me learning, it keeps me writing. I think that these are two things that I'm absolutely passionate about, and the writing, being committed to writing these articles, gives me, that helps me to achieve that goal. For context, within the field of linguistics, I was always most interested in historical linguistics. As the name implies, it's the study of languages of the past, or how languages change.
Is etymology the word for that?
Etymology certainly comes under the umbrella of historical linguistics. Etymology specifically tracing the origins of words. So the article that you mentioned is a prime example of doing some etymology, exactly. So that whole thing, it was, again, the intersection of my interests. We have a little bit of Czech, we have a little bit of Latin, and I suppose it was specifically my chance to write about words that are not very obvious. I always think that I have the soul of an archaeologist. You could present me with some facet of language that is hale and hearty, it's very vibrant in the modern language. Frankly, that will not interest me so much as some fossil or relic of language that actually nobody knows about, nobody cares about, and isn't, shall we say, alive or vibrant in the language today. So in the case of Verba Bohemica, that article just outlines 10 words that look very Czech, but actually have a Latin origin. And the reason for their Czech appearance is because they've been part of the language much longer than many of the other Latin words. I mean, for example, we're in a studio right now. Studio comes from Latin studium. It's a Latin word by origin. It looks a lot like its Latin ancestor because I guess... It's arrived in the Czech language later than others, probably from Italian, given the O ending. In the case of these words, these are words that have been part of the Czech language a lot longer, and as a point of principle, the words have had much more time to be affected by the Czech language, to be absorbed into its sounds and its syllable structure, and consequently to look more Czech. And these are words that really, they by and large, they're words that entered the Old Czech language, or even the pre-Old Czech language, when the language is first in the area that we now know today as Czechia or Bohemia and Moravia. Consequently, they tell us a lot about the time in which they were taken into the Czech language. They refer to Christianity, for example. So these are words like, what do we have there? Kříž, for example, the word for cross, doesn't look much like English cross or Latin crux, for example, or crucem would be specifically the form that was borrowed, because it's had more time. It's been on a longer journey to reach us today in the Czech language. My favourite one, for example, was jeptiška, which means nun. It's a nun in Czech, specifically the religious sister. This is abatissa. It's abbess originally in Latin, but you could say it's kind of got these. I don't know how to say it politely. It's these. It's been these kind of barnacles of Czech that have been attached to either side. You've got the K ending, you've got the J at the beginning, which is very kind of typically Slavic. That's quite an old process of adding J's. Slavic languages used to not like words to begin with a vowel, so that's probably why the J was added. But strip away these barnacles, and the Latin word appears. So that was a real treat to write that piece, and I'm very glad that you read it.
By the way, I just realized, there's no more Czech first name, as Josef, I suppose. I mean, of course, it's in other languages as well, but Josef, Pepík, a very Czech name. And do you know why we call Josef Pepík?
Is this a rhetorical question?
It's completely different.
Yeah, I mean, it is different. I mean, in the case of the diminutives, they sometimes can be different. So I think Honza, for example, for Jan, that's from German.
That's from
Johannes,
German. Yeah.
At a guess. The Peppa, Pepík, Pepina, I think would be, is that feminine?
Josefina.
Yeah. I believe that these are just shortened versions of again, similar rule to Honza in a different language. So
it is. From German. It actually comes from Italian.
Italian, right.
Well, strangely enough for some people, but not strangely enough. I mean, if you know a little bit of the Czech history, in the 18th century, a lot of Baroque buildings were built, and there were a lot of Italians coming in. And in Italian, Giuseppe is the form of Josef, Giuseppe, Pepe, and that's how it got into Czech. Yeah, so Pepík is actually Italian.
There you go. I mean, already you're getting into just great etymology. All these connections. No language exists in a vacuum. No language is an island, to paraphrase John Donne. All of these things are interconnected, and I just love that.
Again, I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff on your website, dannybate.com. I highly recommend it. If I may kind of turn the proverbial page, when you look at linguistics and language in the 21st century, how would you describe the state of linguistics today? Is it popular? I mean, were you kind of rather one-off, among the students in York, or is there a big interest?
I would say it's definitely growing. In fact, in the public sphere, in terms of online public representation of the field, it's actually experiencing a bit of the golden age, I would say. In terms of public linguistics, where people are presenting these concepts from the field, making them accessible through the medium of your choice, be it YouTube or podcasting or books, it's never been better, to be honest, and that's really, really heartening to see. I was part of a pretty large cohort of students, especially in that first undergraduate degree, but most of them were people who'd come to it through a foreign language at school. They didn't actually, like me, know that much about the field on its own terms. The very few people who actually were studying, shall we say, straight linguistics without, say, French language or German language at York. If you include those people, it was probably about 50 of us. If you don't include those people, there's probably about maybe 10 of us hardcore nerds at York who just didn't want the year abroad. We just wanted to study grammar.
Funny thing, I mentioned that I studied Czech language and literature, also English language and literature, back in the 1980s, still under communism, and we had to study kind of elementary basic linguistics, about the Pražský jazykovědný kroužek. This was this linguistic school in Prague exactly in the 1930s. I think that you mentioned as well that was the kind of start of the linguistics as we know it today. Why I mention that? When I was in London for the first time at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, there was a big thing in England that they were putting together this kind of huge body of English language into computer system. And then the idea was that, we will put, all these books and speeches, into internet. We didn't know about internet then, of course, into a computer program, this huge body, and that will help us learn, much more profoundly about the language. Now we live in the age when, as you mentioned, there's, social networks, there's YouTube, there are so many various kind of ways to record the language. Do you think, as a linguist, that it helps us actually to understand the language, or is it just kind of, I would say, adding, to this mass of information that we sometimes don't even know what to do with?
I think it does help, but it can only help through extremely hard work. Basically, somebody has to be at the front line of all this data, processing it and making it usable then for the linguists to come up with their grand ideas. But it definitely does help. We have, thanks to all this information, this mass of data coming in, we have a much better idea of how the English language, for example, actually exists, as to compare that with the English language in the year 1500 or the English language in the year 700, where we're dealing with a very limited number of documents from a very limited number of people. The more data that you have from, and the more, shall we say, respondents or participants who are giving you that data, the closer you can get to actually claiming you know how a language works. Because a language is not this kind of gas that has this DNA, and if you find one bit of language, you extract the DNA, and that's it, that's English. No, it's something that humans do. It's something that exists between all of us, and basically to study English, you need lots and lots of people.
You are listening to Czechast. I'm Vít Pohanka, the host, and my guest today is my colleague and linguist Danny Bate.
All we are talking about is very interesting, but this is Czechast. Let's keep that in mind. What kind of differences did it help you understand between the Czechs and the English? Once you came here, you as a linguist, when you observe, when you get all the information about the language, and I'm asking more about the language use, Is it possible to say, that there are kind of some things that are more typical about English users of their language than the Czech users of their language?
Yes, it could be as well. But knowing the linguistics, has been extremely helpful in getting to know Czech. I would say, for example, a little awareness of the different senses of humour, for example, as they are expressed in the language. I think the British tend to over-rely even on sarcasm, which I don't think is quite there to the same extent among the Czechs, and that's a good thing, if you ask me. I think it certainly helped me to dive into the language to, again, as a historian, as a lover of historical linguistics, that's always going to be my angle, frankly, to get to know the Czech Republic in its proper context, the way it is interconnected. I worry that I'll sound like a broken record when I say that Czech has connections to other languages. It's not this linguistic dragon that sits in the heart of Europe and you must bravely stand up to it and, you'll probably die in the attempt, to be honest. No, it's a language like any other. It's easier for some people, as for some foreign learners, than for other foreign learners, depending on your, shall we say, linguistic background. People often say, Czech is so difficult. What about for Slovaks? Anyway, it's definitely helped me to know about the language from a linguistic point of view, to see how Czech has, the history of the country, the language can give you a kind of perfect microcosm as to what the Czech people have been through. I find, for example, that it may not seem so, it may not seem at first glance, but Czech has all sorts of connections to other, perhaps more populous languages of Europe, namely German and Latin. There are all sorts of words that actually are modelled on German words or Latin words, and that is unsurprising considering how long the Czechs and their language have been here in Europe. It's also not surprising that it's not very obvious because we have things like the National Revival at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries, which sought to somehow purge over Germanisms from the Czech language. Those were the desires of the people leading the revival to sort of raise Czech up to the same status as these other languages, and so the connections to other languages make sense, and the, shall we say, lack of obvious connections to other languages makes sense as well. Czech, no language exists in a political vacuum. Czech tells you as a language what the people have been through.
Exactly, and let me just mention that there was this Czech revivalist, Josef this linguist, who actually wrote in the 19th century the first, I think, official dictionary of German and Czech. And at that time, I mean, it was part of this effort, I mean, to show that Czech language is as good a language, you know, to express everything, all the feelings as German is. And he literally had to invent some words. Like, for example, the German Augenblick. He just literally translated as Okamžik, which is, what would it be in English, I wonder? The blink of an eye?
Yeah, a blink of an eye.
A blink of an eye, yeah. And I think, I mean, that this tendency to speak proper standard Czech survived since then, you know, and survives still, I mean, to this century, I think, the 21st century. I think you mentioned before we recorded this that Czechs are sometimes beating themselves up. Can you explain what you meant by that when it comes to language?
Of course, it's difficult for me not being a Czech, but I do, perhaps I have a helpful outsider's perspective on the language. It seems to me, and I'm going to stress only that's how it seems, that the Czech language exists today within the country in two forms, and one is, shall we say, the standard language, the formal language, the one that you should write, the one that you should speak if you're, you know, having dinner with the president, or I don't know, speaking on the radio, for example. And then you have the everyday Czech. And I don't think anybody disagrees with that. The fact that especially in Bohemia, in the western part of the country, you have almost what you might call diglossia, or at least two dialects or two accents of Czech. But within that division of the language today, there's always going to be evaluation. There's always going to be a sense of one is better, one is proper. Proper tends to be the word that I hear a lot. And that sense of evaluation is not actually inbuilt into the language. It's not inherent. That, again, is a product of specific circumstances. It really is a product of the National Revival, and the people of the National Revival, who, I would say from my perspective, they were self-appointed. Nobody gave them that authority to sort of determine what the Czech language should and shouldn't be for the next few years. And despite that, again, because of the circumstances of the time, they've been enormously successful. So successful in that they have really instilled in the nation to this day a sense of this is good and this is not so good. I won't say bad, but it should be limited to certain contexts, and you shouldn't say it if, for example, you're presenting on Radio Jornal or something like that. And yet, that is a reflection of their own beliefs and desires. That, again, they were not recognizing, or maybe they thought they were, but they were not actually recognizing some pure diamond-like Czech that had to be cleaned and scraped away from all external influence. That language had never existed. I just mentioned earlier, for example, or the Latin words that already existed in the language, or the words of different origins. There are Celtic words, there are Germanic words in Czech, for example. Pure Czech has never existed. And the standard Czech is a product of this very specific moment in time. And they themselves were looking back to previous centuries. They saw this particular period of Czech that we might call Renaissance or humanistic Czech as what should be the basis for their standard language. This is a language that is found in certain documents, the famous Bible of Kralice, for example, which I believe is produced in Moravia. But my point is that this, again, it's no surprise that they thought that was the case, because when those documents and when that language was being written down, Czechs and their language were kind of on top They were running the show. They were independent from, well, fairly independent from, say, the Church of Rome, somewhat independent from the powers of Germany and Austria, and then, of course, Battle of the White Mountain, 1620. It all comes crashing down, and afterwards, when Czech is being, shall we say, squeezed from on top by German, funnily enough, the National Revivalists aren't interested in that post-White Mountain, that Baroque Czech. Everything is political. Frankly, it all exists in some sort of social political context, and I just think it would be sometimes nice for Czechs to remember that, and that actually there's nothing wrong with speaking, shall we say, ordinary common Czech.
I think, I mean, this is truly fascinating. I mean, the way that the language develops, and I am old enough, to kind of see that around myself, because when I started working for Czech radio back in the 1990s as a kind of stringer from Paris, I remember distinctly that once I said děkuju in the end, thank you. And I said děkuju, which is considered to be slightly colloquial. And I was told that I should say děkuji, right? And then later on, I think 20 years later, I said děkuji in Czech radio in the broadcast of Radiožurnál, and I was told you should say děkuju. I mean, děkuji sounds, kind of not natural, And I know this is just a small detail, but it shows you, how it develops. And I'm just wondering. Here in Czechia, we have the official Ústav pro jazyk český, Institute of the Czech Language of the Czech Academy of Sciences, or the Academy of Sciences of Czech Republic, which is not only mapping how the language is used, but it's creating norms, how we should speak. It's normotvorný, it's a norm creating institution. Mm-hmm. To the best of my knowledge, do you have something like that in England?
No. No, we don't. We have institutions, and they have
Oxford Dictionary, for example.
But isn't that so interesting that these institutions are set up? I really don't want to come across as some sort of anarchist or somebody who, says that these things are pointless or stupid. They exist for a reason, but they perhaps have a certain, shall we say, illusion, mirage, that you have to do what they say. And I think that the Czech Republic might be slightly behind in realising that you don't have to do what they say. Dictionary writers in the past in the UK have wielded enormous respect. I mean, for example, we have the most famous of all of them, Dr. Samuel Johnson, who lived in the 18th century. He wrote this, it's not the first dictionary of English, but it's an enormously influential and very financially successful dictionary of English. And what he put in his dictionary, the way he spelled words, did have an effect because of him, not necessarily the way inherently that the words were written, but because he was a respected man, he was a famous man. To write like Johnson in the Johnsonian style back in the day was to show yourself to be a man, probably a man of letters, of writing and that sort of thing. And you don't have to do these things. We choose to do them, whether we realise it or not. We choose to follow these people. And that wave, I think, has given way in the UK, really by the time, sort of the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, when the Oxford English Dictionary is starting to be compiled. The sense of actually the dictionary is not telling you what you should say, just trying to comment or document how you do say it. And that's something that is definitely increasing in this country too. People are not bound to listen to the, how would you say, Ústav
pro jazyk český.
There you go. They are not bound to listen to them. They still wield enormous respect, but I would bet that over the coming decades, centuries, they will become what the Oxford English Dictionary is, which is authoritative, respective, but not listen to this or suffer, do this, or you will somehow be socially reprimanded for it.
We actually touched upon the humor thing, which is different. By the way, it just reminds me when I worked as a correspondent again in Brussels or somewhere, when the Czech politician tries to make a joke in English, 99% of the time it ends badly. It's not funny at all. And they try to translate the Czech jokes into English and they think it works. And it can be even embarrassing, I think, sometimes. Are there some quirks, perhaps, that you find irritating in Czech? Or, some special things that Czechs have a tendency to do that you are not very happy about?
I'm setting myself up here for feedback, but yeah, sure. As a learner of this language, it can be immensely frustrating. When you mention the humour, I think my number one bugbear would be just the number of quotations that form a large basis of Czech humour or Czech humorous conversations. Frankly, 9 times out of 10, I haven't seen the film. And if I did see it, I didn't understand it, so I won't get the quote. I had, when I was first teaching, a student who would consistently say that an absentee member of the class, who was very rarely there, had moved do Humpolce, to Humpolec, and that was hilarious for everyone but me. Now I get the joke. So, I'm not going to say that irritates me. It's just something that you need to be here a while to get to grips with, yeah. There are all sorts of elements of this language that frustrate me, but only as a learner. I will stress that. As a linguist, it continually fascinates me as well. Just trying to work out how the cogs all mesh together, basically.
How do you speak at home with your fiancée, if I may ask?
Mainly English, I do have to say. Mainly English. It has increased, and I did have this sort of a casual remark that I just tweeted out back in the days of Twitter, sort of 9 o'clock in the morning, of just a funny observation that in our household, how does it exactly go? My girlfriend, as she was at the time, my girlfriend and I basically never speak Czech to each other, but we always speak Czech to the cat, who is not Czech, and also a cat, which is absurd. But frankly, I just find that he's not from the Czech Republic, our cat, but he's worthy of the Czech language, and I'm very keen. I stress I vikat with him. I address him in the formal language, of course. He's a very dignified cat, I find. So it's mainly English though between the two of us.
And let me ask you, why did you come back here? Why didn't you stay in England rather?
At what point? Do you mean after my studies, for example?
Yeah.
Or, no, I was...
do you plan to stay here, or do you plan to be kind of binational?
Yeah, I would love to stay here a little longer, if you'll have me, here in the Czech Republic. It suits me very well. I do love it here. I'm in no hurry to return to the UK. It's going through a bit of a rough patch, has been for several years, and when I'm away from it, I can love it more easily, if that makes sense. I can remember it more fondly rather than being there on the ground and confronted with how it's changed. I don't want to sound too maudlin and depressive, but I can't help but notice the ways in which it's not very healthy as a country, the UK, and maybe I can idealise it from a distance.
Finally, let me ask you, what about your plans? What projects are you working on?
Well, I am a glutton for punishment. I never have less than 2 projects on the go at any one time, which is frankly exhausting. I think my number one project is just get to grips with this job here in Radio Prague, which I think it's going okay. We haven't had too many complaints so far. But yes, I have many irons in the fire. I really, really want to keep my hand in with academia. As I said at the beginning, that defined me for 10 plus years. To somehow keep involved in academia. For example, I'm working on a couple of applications. I'm working on some things to present at conferences. I would love to carve out a niche for myself of somebody who just has some connection. I don't have to be a full-time academic. I don't have to be somebody who is completely committed to the academy. But I'd love to keep my hand in somehow, whether it's giving courses here in Prague or presenting at Charles University or attending conferences, because linguistics is everything to me. I won't beat about the bush. It's what I'm thinking about when I'm not thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner and what I'm going to do for my job. It's what occupies my brain. However, I am very glad to say that I really want to pursue the non-academic side of me, and I do have... actually don't know how much I can talk about it, but I have a book coming out this year, and I've signed all sorts of...
excellent!
Yeah, I have, but I've signed all sorts of contracts, which means I'm not entirely sure how much I can say about the book, but it is coming out this year after a tremendous amount of work, which I enjoyed very much, and it is not for an academic audience, it is for everybody. If you read English, it is for you.
Okay, so I don't want to kind of inquire too much about the book, but let me just ask you, how long did it take you to write it?
Much less time than it should have. Basically, I wrapped up the PhD, the final stage of which is something called a viva in the UK, which is a defence. You have this very intense examination, you meet with 2 experts and basically defend your ideas, and wow, what a day that was. I think I'm still recovering, despite, enjoying it, but enormously stressful. That was in June, I think. I should remember the date, June the 6th. And then I basically had a very few months then to sit down and write this book.
You're talking June 2024?
24, and then starting this job. So I got the contract to write this book from a wonderful publishing house in the UK who've been enormously supportive, and then I had to actually sit down and write the thing. That took me, sort of 4 months. 4 months, and I say I've submitted a final copy of it in November, and now it's over to them for the time being, and I can breathe. So I work when I love my work. I work fast. It was very intense. I do not recommend doing this to anybody. It was hell. Excuse my language. It was hell writing a book that I cared about so much in that short a space of time. But I did it. And especially the epilogue to this book, I should say, is non-fiction. I think it's my best piece of writing.
And I suppose we will learn about it on your website, dannybate.com, right, when it comes out?
As much as I can say about it as well. I think I can say some certain things. It is about English, and as I hope I've managed to give a sense of, there's a lot of me in it. I really want to just reach across, take my reader by the hand, and just say, you're so linguistically brilliant. You, the reader. You're so good at what you do. If you're reading this right now, if you're reading my words, hats off to you. Klobok dolu to you. There's this book, and again, it's certainly got a lot of me in it. There's quite a few references to Czech and Prague, in fact, many of which had to be cut in the end, I'm sorry to say.
I am, to my regret, I have to say, because this is Czechast, so I was hoping there would be something about Czechia, but you had to cut it out. What can we do? Danny, well, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. And I'm glad that we can work together.
Likewise, it is a pleasure to work with somebody, a venerable journalist and broadcaster of your status. There's so much to learn from you, and like, for example, doing Czechast. Here's to many more months, years, hopefully, of working together.
Well, that's it for this episode of Czechast. A big thank you to Danny Bate for joining me and sharing his passion for linguistics, and for all the unexpected stories hidden within our everyday language. Now, I'm really excited to announce that my next guest is a real podcast star, nay, celebrity, because Dr. Eleanor Janega is an American broadcaster and medievalist working from Britain. Her scholarship focuses on gender and sexuality, apocalyptic thought, propaganda, and the urban experience in the late medieval period. But what is most important for Czechast, she is really passionate about Czech history, particularly life in Bohemia in the 14th century and the great king of Bohemia and Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV. So I'm really looking forward to speaking to her. If you enjoyed this or other episodes of Czechast, please don't forget to like or follow the podcast. It really helps others discover the show. And if you have any comments or suggestions, I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay curious, take care, and as always, naslyšenou.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.